Hello and welcome to another video review. This is Mortal Kombat, which was released on a lot of systems, but got its beginnings in the arcade. This is a fighting game developed by Midway Games and released in 1992 in arcades, and it was later ported to other systems, most notably the SNES and Genesis, although it has seen ports to all sorts of different systems. There was a DOS version in 1994, they re-released it in the Mortal Kombat Deception Xbox and PS2 versions as an unlockable. It was released on PSP in a collection, and then, of course, the version you're seeing in this video is the Mortal Kombat Arcade Collection on PC, but it was also released on PSN and XBLA. Lots of versions available for this game, each of them with their own ups and downs and stuff like that. So, it's had a long run, and we look back on it today and just remember it as this game that not only started the Mortal Kombat franchise, which has been running ever since that, but also as instrumental in the creation of the ESRB, which is the North American rating system, most notably for the United States, but it's also used in Canada as well. And the simple reason for that was, this was developed and released around the time when violent video games, particularly gory video games, were starting to become more and more commonplace, and there wasn't really anything in place to educate parents on the amount of content or the appropriateness of the content. We had had movie ratings for decades, but we didn't have anything for games. And people generally saw games as just something that adults generally don't play very much. And so, when games like this came out, and they're just bloody and gory, and have a lot of mature themes and such like that, it just shocked people. And we look back on it today and go, well, that's just tame by today's standards. I mean, you look at the newest Mortal Kombat game, and it puts this thing to shame. It's ludicrously gory. It even puts the sequel to shame, which, up until that, was arguably the goriest one. But this is an interesting game. So the real question here is, did it age well? Does it stand up as a game even today? Or is it more of a historical curiosity for people who are just interested in not only the beginnings of the Mortal Kombat series, but also the early years of such like the ESRB and the surge of violent video games and such like that? Well, before we really get into the meat of the game, let's first talk about the presentation, which obviously has not aged well at all. Now, at the time, this was top-of-the-line graphics. You're talking about digitized actors with motion capture and that sort of thing. It was really impressive tech for the time. But nowadays, it looks extremely pixelated, the animations look really clunky, the backgrounds just don't look very animated at all. It really doesn't look good. And while you can get past that, it's harder to get past the sound design, which, again, at the time was pretty top-notch, but it's really hard to get excited when everything sounds very low quality. The audio sounds very digitized. It's a very weird sound to it, especially to the modern ear, where you're used to more high-quality sound effects and such like that. And even at the time, there were better sound effects being used, so it's kind of a weird situation. The music's okay, but the problem with it is that it's just very plain. It doesn't really get you into the mood of the fighting game itself. And while it does work okay for just having some background noise, it's really nothing all that impressive. It's very plain, very simple tunes that just work barely. The voice acting is also rather bad. There's really not much voice acting in it apart from the announcing. So there's really nothing to speak of there. The announcer just sounds kind of disinterested, and it's not all that great. So it's really something that you have to get past the presentation in order to actually get to the game. So the real question is, how's the game? Something interesting to note about this game compared to the later games in the series is that it really doesn't have much story in it whatsoever. You're basically just one of 7 characters in a tournament called the Mortal Kombat Tournament. It's a fighting tournament, and in this game it's run by Shang Tsung, although it's run by somebody else in later games. And you don't really get the real impact of Mortal Kombat 1 on the story until you play through Mortal Kombat 2, which does a better job of actually explaining the story in MK1 than MK1 does. Each character does have their own backstory and their own motivations for joining the tournament, but ultimately, the actual protagonist of the game is Liu Kang, and the idea is that he's trying to save the world from Shang Tsung, the evil sorcerer. That's kind of all you need to know. But in the later games, they expound upon the story more. They have this realm traveling kind of thing going on. It's a very weird thing. But Mortal Kombat 1 in itself is fairly simple. So, what about the game itself? Because the story just doesn't really do anything for you. Well, like I said, there are 7 characters available in the game, although there's also the secret character Reptile available. And each character has their own set of special moves as well as a set of common moves. Like, say, Sub-Zero has the ability to freeze enemies in their tracks, or he has the slide ability, which is extremely annoying, I might add. While Scorpion has the spear on a rope where he pulls you towards him and then you're stunned for a bit. Or Liu Kang has the ability to leap across the screen in this really fast kick. Things like that are all the special moves. The common moves are, of course, high and low punches as well as high and low kicks. And if you do down and then high punch or down and low punch even, it's an uppercut. So, it's things like that that make the fighting in itself fairly simple, but at the same time, they tried to introduce some complexity to it with the block mechanic. Unlike other fighting games where you have to hold back in order to just block and it's automatic, in this one you actually have a dedicated block button, and this is something that the rest of the series has as well. Dedicated block buttons are something of a rarity with fighting games, and it wasn't really until later on that you started to see more games actually using that mechanic. Most of the time, you just saw fighting games use the back block mechanic. And in this one, having that dedicated block button actually roots you in place, but you don't really move when you get hit either. So, if you manage to block a maneuver and the enemy can't react in time, you can actually counterattack pretty easily. There's also juggling in this game, although it's not exactly something I'm good at pulling off. I'll readily admit, I am not good at this game at all. I'm terrible at it. So, when you manage to juggle an opponent, it's actually pretty satisfying because it's not really that easy to do. It was easier to do in later games, but in this one, not so much. And that's partly because this one isn't really all that quick. It feels lethargic by modern standards, and even by standards of games of the time, like Street Fighter, it feels kind of lethargic. But that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something you have to get used to more than anything else. That said, the AI is often rather BS-y, and this is something that extends for the rest of the series, and something I have never liked about the Mortal Kombat series. The AI has always been rather BS-y. They're able to hit you when you can't hit them and such like that. It gets really annoying. It's a lot worse in later games in the series, but in this one, it is sort of the beginnings of that. That said, the fighting itself feels fairly solid, if rather dated and lethargic. And the addition of the finishing move, the fatality, was something that was a pretty big deal at the time. We hadn't seen anything like that before. And while you may look at the moves and go, well, those are tame by today's standards, at the time, they were a huge deal. Those were just horrifyingly gruesome at the time. And nowadays we just look at that and go, well, that's really tame. Look at MK9. That thing's ridiculous. But at the time, again, those were a huge deal. And being able to pull off a fatality back then was just awesome. Because you had to learn it from playing. They didn't tell you how to do it. They didn't have move lists available. You couldn't really go online to find a moves list and say, okay, this is how you do it. No, you had to figure it out on your own. And if somebody was able to pull off a fatality, it was just awesome. And it adds on that extra bit of humiliation. It's like, yeah, I beat you and then I finished you off. Take that. Now, obviously, These got more and more ridiculous as time went on. With MK2, they just made them, a lot of them actually, really gruesome. Way more so than this one. This one was tame compared to MK2. And then on up to today, where in MK9 they were actually kind of sickening in a lot of spots. But it's really a weird situation. Like, Mortal Kombat 1 is decent. It's dated, it feels kind of lethargic, it's very not pretty to look at, it doesn't sound good. It's more of a historical curiosity than a legitimately good game to the modern gamer, or even somebody who's looking to see where the MK series started. It's not all that great of a game in light of its sequels. At the time, it was pretty solid. And if you view it as more of a historical piece than anything else, you'll probably get something out of it, and it's worth checking out. But if you're going into this thing looking to have a really good fighting game experience, I recommend going with the sequel rather than this particular game. Thanks for watching.